So, um, a very warm welcome to all of you, and a huge thank you to our speaker today, Dr. TamaraTurner. Tamara is a fantastic scholar and a friend of mine, and I'm really, really pleased to have her here presenting what I'm sure is going to be an excellent presentation. Tamara works at the intersection of psychological anthropology, music, and sound studies. She specialises in the relationship between sound, affect, and consciousness, particularly as it relates to mental, emotional health in Algeria and Morocco. Since 2008, she's conducted in-depth ethnographic fieldwork with various North African Sufi communities. Her award-winning doctoral research was the first to thoroughly document the musical repertoire, practice and history of Algerian Diwan, a nocturnal trance ritual of the Bilaliya Sufi order. She's currently a research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, where she also co-directs a cross-disciplinary research group comprising historians, psychologists, and neuroscientists. So welcome, Tamara, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. A big thank you back to Steve Wilford and Matthew Machen-Ottenrieth, if I'm pronouncing your name right. I'm really pleased to be a part of this series of Sonic Conversations in the Western Mediterranean. The topic of my talk today is a theme that I encountered in my fieldwork back in 2013. It was sort of a background theme, these Pan-African and sort of phenomena about looking south. So I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to dig back into my data and do some follow-up interviews with musicians and journalists and activists about these current phenomena today in Algeria. So this opening slide are some images that will come up in the talk on the left-hand side of in the Diwan ritual. That was the focus of my PhD, these ways that ritual insiders are looking south and trying to make contemporary connections to their supposed African pasts. And then on the right-hand side, 2 album covers from some Pan-African groups currently in Algeria that are also calling to mind these notions of looking south. So Shuf Janub in the top right of Look South is literally the name of one of the albums. So I just want to give a bit of overview of the talk today, what I hope to accomplish. So first, a bit of background about my fieldwork context, how I came into this research milieu. I'll explain then these 2 connected phenomena of looking south, which tends to be more ritual insiders in the west of Algeria, and then Pan-African phenomena, which tends to be more based around Algiers and urban centers. And they overlap and inform each other. I'll show this through case studies of both the ritual music in private ritual settings, as well as when ritual music is staged. And then in these popular music settings I mentioned in urban centers such as Algiers and Constantine. So these worlds constantly inform one another. I'll be explaining why and how that happens. I'm interested in what kinds of trajectories this implies, what directions this is headed, what the purpose of these phenomena are. And then I also want to consider what's at stake. So what are the questions that we need to attend to here? So this slide, to introduce the fieldwork context, the most interesting, I think, is the one in the top left-hand corner, which is the way that I entered into the field in Algeria within a month of my first period of fieldwork in 2013, which was to perform with a group of these guys in Algiers that are non-ritual insiders. So that is that they're young men who learned the repertoire through recordings that circulated in Algeria through friends. For some of them, there was a Diwan master musician living in their neighborhood. I met them through social media in 2012, finishing up my master's work on the Gnawa. And so I corresponded with them for a year over Facebook, actually. And when I arrived in Algeria in 2013, they met me at the airport in Algiers, and I started visiting their rehearsals. They invited me to perform with them at the annual festival in Béchar, which is in the southwest of Algeria, near the Moroccan border. So that is to say that this popular music scene in Algiers is directly gives access, or gave me access, to the ritual world and is informed by ritual. So these guys essentially took me to the elders and vouched for me and kind of helped me go in. this photo is connected to the one in the bottom right-hand corner, which was that I ended up on Algerian TV. This is Radio 3, Algeria TV station 3, where then scholars and musicians in Algiers became interested in my research in Diwan. So this sort of feeding back and forth between young men in particular in Algiers who are fascinated by the Diwan ritual, but usually don't attend for various reasons and just kind of want to learn the music. But then the majority of my fieldwork was in ritual spaces with both men and women. Men tend to be the musicians here, but also speaking with women leaders as well. And this was your kind of typical anthropological research with participation and body participation, learning to play the music, recording ritual. So yeah, and a lot of interviews with interlocutors. So the phenomena that I'm discussing today, so first we have Pan-Africanism with its roots from the 1969 Pan-African Festival in Algiers, and then later the second edition in 2009. And these two historical events were first the 1969 really planted the seed, not just musically, but also phenomenologically and in terms of ideology of Pan-Africanism that still exists today in Algeria. This phenomena, as I hinted, tends to be located in urban centers for outsiders to Diwan, that is. And the most recent developments are these musical projects, fusion projects mostly, with the express intent of sort of unifying Africa. This is related to what the journalist for Algérie Press Service, Sarah Harfi, called an opening up. So she called it an ouverture, an esprit that was opening up around 2010 to 2015, it was particularly in Algiers for these sorts of, for the music of other African countries. We can think back to, well, at this time, Khalida Toumi was the Minister of Culture, and she's really well known for having brought a lot of money to culture in Algeria. And Sarah mentioned that there were just dozens and dozens of cultural events and musicians that were brought to do workshops. So this was a really rich time in Algiers for musicians wanting to connect with other musics. So she thinks this also influences these Pan-African kinds of phenomena. So Sarah, again, is one of the key journalists who works on culture in Algeria. And then we have the looking south phenomena, which is very similar and relates to and informs Pan-Africanism. And this is where Diwan insiders, so ritual musicians, whose ancestors were slaves, are looking back again at these sub-Saharan African pasts. So there's a lot of discourse around connecting with these difficult pasts, but wanting to claim a kind of authenticity there, Black authenticity. So race issues are really important here, and I'll get more into that later. So this is happening from within Diwan, and it's become quite a popular thing within the last 7 to 10 years. In this case, it tends to happen more in the west of Algeria, and the more recent projects having to do with this, where we see this happening, is through associations and cultural events that ritual musicians are now establishing. As I mentioned, both demonstrate attachments to what it means to be African. So in the Pan-African sense, there's always, if it's not explicitly stated, it's implicitly implied that this means what does it mean to be Black or white in Africa, as opposed to North Africa, in Algeria, or sub-Saharan Africa. And as Steve and Matthew were mentioning, I think this is important to the way that in the Mediterranean that identities were forming and questions were coming up about race. This was a big topic at the Pan-African Festival, where I'll talk about more later. So there, in both of these cases, so if we look broadly at Pan-Africanism and looking south, there's ambivalence about difficult Algerian histories, not just colonialism, but also of slavery. So these are not monolithic, and there's definitely some insecurities and anxieties that are fueling these phenomena. So then again, I'll get into case studies of how different notions of Africa are evoked in these two primary phenomena. So roughly in terms of how these phenomena are being manifested is through discourse and action. So the emic viewpoint, emic meaning so ritual insiders who are practicing this Diwan ritual, What happens here is a lot of discourse around ancestors, as I mentioned, sub-Saharan ancestors, stories about the trans-Saharan slave trade, and then family names which place them in sub-Saharan Africa, like Zinder and Kano. So there's a lot of oral history attempts to make these links. Secondly, there are quite a few debates about ritual protocols. So Diwan, as I'll show in a minute, emerged out of various ethno-linguistic groups from sub-Saharan Africa. 7 are usually mentioned. And so because of this heterogeneity, there's a lot of debate around what is really truly African, to put it very simply. And then, as I mentioned with ambivalence, anxieties around these sort of pre-Islamic sub-Saharan African practices, that there's still a lot of anxiety in Algeria about this, both from within and outside of the ritual. At the same time, there's a romanticization and a pride for Blackness and being connected to sub-Saharan Africa, particularly now with this sort of Pan-African spirit as being, there's been a renaissance of this. And lastly, in this insider category, arguments about ritual purity, and this comes back to transmission problems for Diwan because it evolved out of the trans-Saharan slave trade. There's a huge amount of loss of knowledge that occurred. So in terms of etic viewpoints, so that would be these musicians in Algiers, for example, we constantly see this trope of Mama Africa being invoked. The goal here is to establish a kind of shared history, even a shared future, as being one culture. So you find a lot of discourse around unity. And then, especially in terms of Algiers and these musical projects, a lot of times you find musicians that want to compare the experience of Algerians in France with Black musicians in Algeria experiencing racism. So there's ways of trying to collapse these different Algerian histories. As I mentioned, peacemaking and unity as same culture is often in the discourse here as part of the goals of Pan-Africanism. It happens also through musical practice. And then what is the real Algeria? So this comes up a lot in my interviews and speaking with musicians and journalists. Sometimes Tuareg music in the south of Algeria is also invoked here as this is what really is Algerian music. But Diwan is considered the most African of Algerian music. So it's used as a source. In most of these cases, Diwan becomes the first source of looking south or of Pan-Africanism. And in terms of this looking south and ways that musicians are trying to attach themselves to sub-Saharan Africa, we have an immense confusion around the Moroccan Gnawa, because most Algerians are not familiar with the fact that Algeria has its own Afro-Maghribi tradition, Diwan. And because the marketplace Gnawa music is so much more popular and well-known, people know the songs, that you have Algerian musicians in Algiers actually quoting Moroccan songs instead of Algerian ones. So on to more about Diwan itself. This is a map showing the various trans-Saharan trade routes. What's interesting about this map is it shows the complexity that not only were there north-south routes, but also east-west trading. So origins are very difficult to nail down if at all possible. But there is the discourse in Diwan that it emerged out of 7 different ethno-linguistic groups, the most commonly cited being Bambara, Fulani Pul, and Hausa, and Songhai. So these 4 tend to be the most popular. This is a photo within ritual in the west of Algeria. So as I mentioned, Diwan is kind of this focus here in this talk because it is a source that is constantly gone to from these Pan-African projects. Again, it's seen as the most African music in Algeria, although there are, I must mention, other kinds of Black musics in Algeria that are not associated with this, but the vast majority are these Balelia. They associate themselves with Bilal. And in both, so in the music in Algiers, when Diwan is trying to be evoked or Gnawa is trying to be evoked, you will almost always find lutes, so some kind of gimbri or gnaber, and then these very famous krakeb, which probably most of you have seen or heard. So these are also kind of the emblematic instruments that come up in Pan-African projects as a way of signaling, okay, we're moving south here. Diwan musicians are very active about curating and weaving legacies and imaginaries about their histories. And again, because it emerged out of the trans-Saharan slave trade, there's an immense amount of knowledge loss. There's quite a lot of things that have been shored up within the songs and the objects that can be traced to the Hausa and Songhai ethno-linguistic groups. But this is an ongoing project. And so these photos, the one in the top right, is a photo board at the Zawiya in Saida in Western Algeria of ancestors going back generations or decades. And the one on the left is a shrine that was erected during a diwan in northwest Algeria of also, again, ancestors. And on the table, there are ritual objects, some that are fabricated by the man who created this shrine. So they're not actual historical objects, but sort of his imagination of what these things would have looked like. So there's a self-reflexivity and a constant project of sort of renewing and searching for these histories. In the ritual order, so the Diwan ritual is entirely constituted by songs. And these blocks, it's not important if you can read the text, they just represent the various family groups of songs in the Diwan ritual. So we have on the right-hand side, Migzawin and Hausawin in these two blocks. And these repertoire are considered the most African of this African ritual. So even Diwan insiders, they look to these song suites as being, well, these are still the most authentic. These are the ones that are the most connected. One of my interlocutors put it as, in these suites, you really feel the voodoo. So he said, we know that the whole Diwan ceremony, there's some voodoo, but this is where you really feel the voodoo. And there are reasons why musicians say this. For one thing, particularly in the Migzawin song suites, Arabic is not sung very much, just a few words in Arabic, but it's mostly sung in a language they call Kuria, which seems to be a mix of Hausa and maybe Kanuri. And it's no longer spoken in Algeria, but it's considered the African language. So there's a lot of these aesthetics and actual ritual components that are used to argue this connection to Africa. So Migzawa is the primary one. Migzawa, as they say it in Diwan, actually can be traced to the Hausa Maguzawa, which is a real ethno-linguistic group, part of the Hausa family. This is not explicitly known in Diwan, though. They call it Migzawa, but except for one or two musicians, there's no actual connection with this group. They sort of think of Migzawa as a group of spirits, but it is part of the Hausa ethno-linguistic group, and it was seen as these sort of non-Islamic or pre-Islamic. So there was already, even before Diwan, these anxieties around animist practices of the Magazawa. And actually, I found a fascinating citation in I think it was 1933 book by Beauville Caravans of the Great Sahara, where he mentions a group that very much describes what's happening today in Diwan regarding the Migzawa. So again, these are considered the most African of the Diwan repertoire by not just the insiders, but also actually the outsiders who know anything about the ritual songs. Because of these animist connections, it's also the most contested group of songs. And yeah, the Diwan practicants consider themselves good Muslims, so there's always quite a lot of debate around this. One of the things, as I mentioned about the texts, it's really drastically different dress and actions and overall aesthetics in the Migzawa from the rest of the repertoire. Migzawa happens about 4 in the morning, typically, of this ritual, which goes all night long. By this point, a lot of people have gone, but it's really remarkable how different this song group is from all of the rest. And now I'm going to show you a quick video from a ritual of these elders enacting Migzawa with, notice the headdresses, the bows and arrows, sort of depicting African hunters. And you'll notice there are not very many people left at this ritual, again, being 4 in the morning. So hopefully the sound will be all right here. So this is what Migzawa looks in a nighttime Diwan ceremony. It's also performed in Saida, which is a town in Western Algeria that also claims this lineage to Magzawa. And this is their way of evoking Magzawa during a daytime ceremony with drums and a carnival-like atmosphere. Yeah, it's held over an entire day. So I'll show you a bit of this. All right. And another group tied to Saida is the Sarji family. So this is a photo of when I mentioned these cultural associations that are happening. And so one of the son of Majdoub, and you see Migzawin Waled Majdoub in the top left. So Majdoub was probably the most famous Diwan Malam in Algerian memory. And his son, Noordin, has since formed this Migzawin Waled Majdoub, so a cultural association essentially claiming this Migzawa heritage. Now, interestingly, in Viviana Pak's 1964 book, L'Arbre Cosmique, she actually does say that Bou Sarji, so this is Majdoub Sarji, was the one who brought the Migzawa repertoire to Saida. So this is one citation I did find where at this time, there were certain families that were in charge of different songs from ethno-linguistic groups. I'll show you a quick clip of this particular group performing Migzawa at the Beshar Festival, also evoking this African hunter theme with headdresses and animal pelts. It's even a little bit more extreme than what we saw in ritual in terms of sort of characteristic or stereotypical images of what looking south might mean. So that's the Bashar Festival, where in the last, I'd say 5 to 7 years, more and more groups are presenting this on stage. And I'll get into the Bashar Festival in a moment about why this is significant, that in public spaces, more and more of these insider musicians are wanting to perform Diwan. So this next video, also at Bashar, is a group from Mascara, also in the same geographical area in the West. Also contenders of holding the heritage of Migzawa. And they won the festival prize this year with largely, well, it was said largely because of their fantastic costumes. But anyway, it was significant that they won the festival with the Migzawa repertoire. So part of performing this kind of repertoire in Bashar is also a way of establishing and laying claim to knowledge. As I mentioned, because Migzawa comes so late in the ritual, 4 or 5 in the morning, when most people have gone home, even ritual insiders today feel like very few people understand and know this ritual anymore. It's kind of falling away. So there was this resurgence of Migzawa within the last 5 to 7 years. And now suddenly it's appearing on stages, and yet it's still considered exotic and rare, even within Diwan communities. One, because it's coming so late in the ritual, and also because of these sort of these anxieties around, well, should we be performing music that has the most animist pre-Islamic connections to sub-Saharan Africa? So now on to the festival in Bashar, which was started in 2007. The way it works is anyone can submit a dossier, an audition tape, more or less, to the commissaire in Bashar to participate in the festival. Usually they hire between 12 and 15 troops. They come from all over Algeria, and sort of the clincher of this is that you'll have ritual musicians who've been playing the music for 40 years, applying at the same time as a 20-year-old guy who learned the gimbri from his friend around the corner. So this creates some somewhat predictable debates, you can imagine, around authenticity and who has the right to perform this repertoire. In speaking with the commissaire of the festival in Bashar, he listed the goals of the festival as to uplift Diwan as intangible cultural heritage. So this was an actual project. They were trying to get it classified as intangible cultural heritage. And then to encourage Diwan musicians to improve the music. And this did not go over very well, as you can imagine, with musicians. This was a quote from him about, we need to kind of get them on stage and so that they're current and people can understand them. And so it's something that's consumable by, a wider Algerian public. So this was part of the plan of the festival. And then, of course, this results in territorial battles over who owns this knowledge and why should we be asked to improve. Ritual musicians who don't want to stand up on stage because they're used to sitting in ritual. They don't want to have choreography, but they sort of succumb because this is how you win the festival. And if you win the festival, you go on to Algiers to perform in a more prestigious festival. This is a clip advertising. This was a television spot on the Bashar Festival with lots of talking heads and shots of musicians and interviewing the audiences about what they thought about it. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip past that. There's not anything terribly critical in there, except for the commissaire of the festival saying in French, yes, we are submitting Diwan to be part of intangible cultural heritage. So as I mentioned, you have groups coming from all over. So primarily, the vast majority will be these groups of young men from urban centers. These are some of the ones that are the most beloved. Wolad Bamber, I think I mentioned the name, was this group that I first came into contact with and was coerced to perform with them on stage. And then Wolad Hausa in the top left, that are still active, based in Algiers. And Diwan al-Bahja, also based in Algiers, also quite beloved by the Algiers youth, who tend to play Gnawa songs, actually. They primarily only play Gnawa songs. But these are some of the top groups that people would know the names of. So as I mentioned, then the three winners, so there's first, second, and third prize, cash prizes also for the Bashar Festival. They go on to Algiers to perform. And so this creates, this sort of prestige then creates some problems between older and younger musicians. In 2015, this was a particularly strong festival and particularly prestigious. Those who went on to play were joined on stage by the likes of Hamidou Kasri, a very famous Gnawa Malam, Karim Ziad, Basakou Kouyaté, Lem Shaheb, Richard Bona, Hassan Basharia, so quite a lineup. And in a sense, it was really trying to be kind of another Pan-Af sort of festival. I want to show you some clips from this. This is a spot on television also sort of advertising this festival. So you can just get a sense of it. So hopefully I can sort of skip around here and see my timestamps here. Hamidou Kasri. Basakou Kouyaté. And Richard Bona. So this was significant because of the prestigiousness of the artist, but also it was sort of an attempt to recapture this Pan-African kind of spirit with bringing together artists from all over Africa and also from the States, African-American artists from the States. And this brings us to the Pan-Af Festival in 1969 in Algiers, very significant to all of these phenomena. So Algerian independence in 1962 inspired quite a lot of excitement across the globe. Amilcar Cabral, hero of the Guinea-Bissau anti-colonial struggle, said, quote, "Muslims go to pilgrimage in Mecca, Christians go to the Vatican, and national liberation movements go to Algiers. So Algiers came to be seen as kind of the Mecca of revolutionaries. And in her article, Flickering Fault Lines in 2016, Paraska Tolan-Skilnik argues that Algeria in particular occupied a central position in the Pan-Africanist discourses and even came to define those conversations. So this wasn't just a music festival. There were really key pivotal political activist discussions that took place around race and politics, what it meant to be Pan-African. So was it based on race? Was it a struggle of Blacks against whites? Was this, what did African unity have to do with a cultural Africanness founded on historical events, on a common land? Or was this a common history of colonial oppression? And what about white North Africa and sub-Saharan Black Africa? And these are questions that are still important and are still coming up or being hinted at in Pan-African projects today. Furthermore, there were Black Panther leaders at this festival who were mingling and discussing and debating these issues, including Eldridge Cleaver and Stokely Carmichael, then Miriam Makeba's husband, and they had settled in Algiers by this point. Miriam Makeba, as you may know, then she became nicknamed as Mama Africa. So I wonder also how this thread then has continued to weave itself through current projects. So again, these questions about Pan-Africanism and what did it mean, what was it really about, we still see that in some of the examples that I'll show you later of these rock bands more in Algiers. Right, and so some of the big names there were Miriam Makeba, Manu Dibango, Nina Simone, Barry White, Archie Shep. So it was quite a lineup, and it's such a great video. It's just about a minute long. I'm going to show you this advertisement for the festival.
Algiers. From all over Africa, they came to the first Pan-African cultural festival. Singers, dancers, musicians, and lovers of the Afro-art. It was just about one of the most uninhibited and talented gatherings ever seen. Masses of life turned night into day, and thousands flocked to watch the skill of the dancers and thrilled to the exotic rhythm. From the moment the festival began until its magnificent climax, it had been one long, fascinating show of unbridled talent.
All right. So this being in Algiers, then I need to give some current context then to how these waves of Pan-Africanism started to grow and emerge within Algiers. When we talk about Diwan in Algiers, there are two main families that are really active. Algiers used to have an incredible Diwan scene, and well, in the last 100 years, it's dwindled. And now we have the Bahas and the Sudani families. And both of these families have been instrumental in the way that Diwan has begun to be taken up by popular musicians in Algiers. So they've been involved in bands themselves, not just influenced them, but also been a part of these bands. So Ben Isa Bahaz is the most well-known of the Bahaz family. He's on the top right there. And this is a photo of him. So he was well known in particular neighborhoods in Algiers as being really open to the youth and training anybody who was curious. His big moment, he was said to be the first Algerian Malam to go on stage, to take Diwan out of the ritual setting, and then to perform with the Algerian rock band T34. He also then was developing relationships with ONB, Orchestre National des Barbès, which is known as ONB, which is one of the most famous bands still for Algerians. And he formed his own fusion group Diwan Zer in the 90s. And of course, this is about a decade or two after in Morocco, when you had in the 1970s, this kind of growing connection between Gnawa and popular music. but there was this parallel history happening in Algeria directly with Malams entering fusion groups or forming their own fusion groups. So this growing, this is again Sarah Harfi, the journalist, who pointed out that this growing demand for groups like ONB and Ganawa diffusion was part of the reason why not only Ganawa festivals started appearing, these Bashar festivals started appearing, but also an increase of a lot of different young men forming groups such as these. So I would love to be able to play you this whole video. It's so wonderfully cheesy, but I can't. So I'm gonna skip to the part where Ben Isa, this well-known Malam, appears at the end of this very odd video. As kind of his little cameo, but this was a significant moment. This is supposedly the first moment that Algerian Diwan appeared in a popular music group. So let's see if I can get this. Sorry, yeah, that's right. So that's his little cameo. You could sort of hear the gimbri in the beginning of the song, kind of every now and then you hear the gimbri threaded through this rock song. I recommend going to check the song out later. It's quite entertaining. So then in 2009, we have what was an attempt to be sort of a reincarnation of Pan-Af. It was so beloved. There were such fond memories of it. However, it was described as a bad remake without panache and without true African soul. This was one newspaper that reported the way it was received. So it was deemed a failure. There were still big artists like Salif Keita, Cesaria Evora, Sheb Khaled, Youssou N'Dour, Alpha Blondy, who performed. But yeah, in terms of the way the public remembers it, it was nowhere near as important as 1969. However, it did instigate a lot more of this. It kind of renewed this Pan-African spirit among the youth. I want to show you a quick just the first few moments of the entry of this, because of Miriam Makeba's song in the background, Ana Hurra fil Jazair, I'm free in Algeria, and she was naturalized in 1972 and lived in Algiers. So wasn't it another example, again, called Mama Africa, of this sort of Pan-African spirit?
Algiers, July 2009.
So there you hear her famous song that's been quoted quite a lot. So from this 2009 festival, then there was this resurgence among young men in particular in Algiers wanting to take up this Pan-African spirit. And then again, what Sarah Harfi called also this opening to other cultures. There's many groups I could trace. I want to stick with the main one, Afriqiya Spirit, because they then went on a center stage tour in the US in 2016 and traveled all over the African continent actually playing music. Also because Shakib Bouzidi, the leader, was trained with Ben Isa Bahaz, this Malam that I mentioned, who was the first to appear in these bands, a really significant figure. So he studied Gimbri with him, and he knows the ritual repertoire quite well. So he is one of the only that I know that actually sets Diwan songs with pop rock arrangements. So a lot of these other groups will hint at it, but he actually is taking these Diwan songs and not just playing them on stage, but actually arranging them for the stage, and tries to do this with as much respect and consideration that he can. I recently went back to interview Shakib to ask how this tour went and how the reception was, what his experience was of Pan-Africanism. He shared that it was surprising to him how difficult it was to get rhythms going in these workshops that he held too, that even between different countries, that they might have accents in different places. They're basically all the same rhythms, but it was still quite difficult. Shakib also expressed that he felt like there was a shared future in Pan-Africanism and that he wanted to have this sense of unity. And he does have a song about unity, but I'm not going to show you that one today. I'll show you another one. But this is one of the most interesting groups in that way, that is in contact with ritual musicians and trying to make it trying to bring it into to a wider audience with this Pan-African spirit. I also met Shakib through the ritual community in Algiers. So one thing that was interesting is looking at the press kit when they went to the States of how they were being advertised. Again, we see Mama Africa coming up quite a lot here, and this is Shakib on the left with Sakura. Also in another piece, Mama Africa invoked once again, and then a piece on citing instances from the ritual, so trying to evoke a sense of ritual. Diwan is food, fellowship, and song. So always these links to ritual as a source. Again, the sort of source of a Pan-African spirit. So I'm going to show you some bits of this particular song that Shakib arranged that is a Diwan song from the ritual repertoire. I'm going to just show you a couple of clips of it, and then I'm going to go to an actual Diwan ritual and play you a version of that song from ritual, so you can see how far these worlds are apart from one another, but how they speak to each other musically. Okay, and I want to just play you a bit of the second phrase of this that you'll hear in the ritual as well. Second couplet here. Okay, now a couple of instances from ritual here, just to give you a taste. And one more interesting moment of intensified trance towards the ends of Lilia. All right, so hopefully in the audio you can piece out and hear these Lilia and the choruses that are happening there. So that's just to give you an idea of these very different worlds, but again that are always informing one another. So I mentioned, and this is on the way towards conclusion of Gnawa confusion, and this is in reference to Andrew Mark's article with this title, Gnawa Confusion. And as I mentioned in the Pana Festival of '69, there were a lot of issues and questions around race. Houari Boumediene who had wanted this festival to mean essentially that the Mediterranean was considered a part of this Pan-African dialogue. This comes up now in an interview, several interviews, but this one in particular is interesting, by Amazik Kateb, the leader of Gnawa Diffusion. I can't go into much history here. Some of you may know this group, but in any case, he's Amazik or Berber, so he's a white Algerian, as they say. And so this is his way of comparing his experience in France with the experience of Black musicians in Algeria. What can be a greater homage than to see a white person playing the gimbri, which is the emblematic musical instrument of the Black man he despised and martyrized yesterday? The kind of homage does not resolve much, of course. It is above all necessary that the descendants of slave traders that we are have the courage and strength to recognize that hurtful past. So further on in interviews with him, he's invoking a oneness and a unity and getting beyond this past and doing it through music by taking up the gimbri, which we can talk about more later in Q&A. And again, this sort of collapsing Algerian histories of Algerians in France under colonialism and descendants of slaves as Blacks in Algeria, Black Algerians. A tiny little footnote I won't go too much into, but in terms of this Gnawa confusion, the famous Khaled in one of his songs, TamaraTurner, also is quoting Gnawa songs. And he grew up right around the corner from Diwan. A lot of my interlocutors in Oran told me, oh yeah, Khaled would pop in, and there was one or two Diwans where I missed Khaled by just a couple of hours. And so he knows the Diwan scene, but yet he's still quoting Gnawa songs. So it's an interesting footnote. Which I won't go into. I hinted at ONB and so they have this association with Algiers and Diwan scenes happening in Algiers. This group on Bania on the bottom right is led by Hafid Badari, who toured with ONB and also in a photo previously was seen playing in an Algiers Diwan with musicians. So there's a lot of this intermingling and mixing, which again is not necessarily surprising, but just that there's these ongoing debates between these communities around these looking south and Pan-African aspirations. There's so many groups I could talk about and should mention. Jobaturi is another one. I'm going to skip this video. Jamawi Africa, from which I got that first slide of Mama Africa, which is not expressly an African kind of band, but in this particular album, they have a song called Ganawa Lila Ganawia. And then lastly, Al Fukara Assembly, which some of you might have heard of in the UK because they gave a presentation in the UK. They were a crowd-funded project led by Walid Khalifi from Constantine, who wanted to get together musicians from Algeria and then also Ghana and Burkina Faso. They were interviewed by the BBC. It was a pretty successful project in terms of the amount of songs they recorded. I wasn't able to get in touch with Walid to follow up on how this went, but there we find also similar dialogues around shared futures, shared pasts. And you can find the interview on BBC. I can send you the link later if you're interested to look at it and how they conceive of Pan-Africanism. So for wrapping up some things to talk about and discuss, how do we think about appropriation in these contexts within Algeria, Algerians appropriating other Algerians? What sorts of issues may we want to involve with that? In terms of the particular historical moment in which we find ourselves, where white supremacy is being questioned in new and challenging ways, how does this influence ways of theorizing this in post-colonial theory and in critical race studies? How have the debates changed or not since the 1969 Pan-Af? I would venture at first to say that the marketplace and capitalism that started out of the 70s and the way that life changed in Algeria had a huge effect on the way that those discourses became less politicized and more dispersed within the marketplace. I'm leaving a lot of this theorization and questions about race open. To be very honest, I find myself in a very awkward position of being the white girl who's commenting on these debates, and many of these people who are my friends, who I spend a lot of time with. And I'm honestly, I'm quite paralyzed about how, at this particular moment, how to theorize this. So I welcome your comments and questions and to talk about this. And thanks very much for coming. I look forward to what you have to say.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tamara. That was absolutely wonderful talk. I'm sure there's lots and lots of questions that we're all going to want to ask. Like I said at the start of the event, could you please either type a question into the chat function in Zoom, or if you'd like to ask your question sort of in a face-to-face, as it were, context, please just type something along the lines of "I'd like to ask a question" into the chat, and I'll invite you to open your microphone and ask your question directly to Tamara. So I will give you just a moment to sort of think of your questions. I had a quick question which I'll ask whilst people are typing and thinking of things. It dawned on me, I was thinking about kind of geographies and sort of flows of culture and ideas and all those sorts of things. And it seemed to me that particularly with the sort of the more urban musicians that you were talking about, there's the looking south towards Mama Africa. There's the looking west towards Morocco and towards Ghana. There's the looking north towards Europe in terms of the sort of capitalism and the sort of commercial success of musicians. Is there also a looking east towards Stambeli and sort of those traditions? Is there any sort of sense of what lies east of Algeria, or does that not really factor into the equation?
That's a great question. Thanks, Steve. In a few instances, I did come across that. This group, Wulad Bambara, who I worked with and performed with, they were quite fascinated by Stambeli and had come across some Stambeli recordings. They were fascinated by the different rhythms of Stambeli. And we're trying to work that into their repertoire to perform in Bashar, actually, as this, oh, nobody's going to do this. You know, everyone's trying to be new and exciting so they'll win the prize. So when I was rehearsing with them, they did, for a while we were rehearsing a Stambeli song. But that's really the main instance where there was much of an awareness about looking east. Just trying to think if anything else comes up. But yeah, most of the discourse was around the Gnawa and this sort of competitive feeling about the Gnawa, of how well known they are, that it's folklore. But then others saying, well, the Gnawa really have it organized. You know, the Diwan's kind of fallen apart. So mostly comparing themselves with Gnawa in that way.
Great, thank you. Martin, I think you've got a question you'd like to ask.
Hi there, Tamara. Thanks very much for the paper. Very generous with your ideas and materials, as always.
Thanks.
I was struck throughout the paper that the marking of southernness was very consistently related to musical instruments, stylistic repertoires. And here's a real Mediterraneanist kind of framework for this. Alan Lomax, I think, would be wanting us to look at the voice, wouldn't he? Because he felt that voices were the site of particular kinds of conflicts, particular kinds of tensions, particular kinds of libidinal, particular kind of like indexical relationships to kind of social forms and processes. So I mean, it struck me that voice was lurking there in the background, but never quite in the foreground. Is it possible for you to say something about what might constitute a southern voice in this context, or looking southwards, or looking in a southern direction with the voice?
Do you mean sonic qualities as opposed to something more metaphorical of voice?
Timbre, sonic qualities, what Stephen Feld calls timbral socialities. You know, I mean, these, you know, the ways in which we kind of create identifications around vocal qualities. Because in other contexts, and particularly in the kinds of things that interest me in the Eastern Mediterranean, a lot hinges on that. I mean, this conversation would very much be about what the voice and what the voice is doing. And I think it would scarcely be about musical instruments or specific repertoires at all.
Right, right. In these particular phenomena with these young groups in Algiers, for example, who are taking it up, it tends to be focused around instruments, but there definitely are debates within the Diwan community about timbre and speed, and the speed of songs, because then you're losing the ringing and the harmonics and the timbre, which typically is linked to the Gimbri, but not always. There are some discourses around the voice. But so thicker, more resonant, and even sort of out of tune. Gimbris are seen as being older and more authentic, and the old guys used to play that way. They didn't bother to everything's perfect and the pentatonic. It was all about just mood and kind of accompanying the singers. Whereas now this sort of precision that's happening in Algiers and being in studios and tuning to keyboards and guitars, they have to be tuned in a particular way. And so this discourse is definitely happening around timbre and tuning of instruments. I can't think of anything expressly on on the voice in that way, except for one thing that was happening in Saida, where when if somebody was singing as the Kuyobango, who is this main singer who sings the call, and then there's the response. At times when this lead singer was white, there were discourses about, well, he hasn't suffered, so he can't really sing this music. You really have to have a black singer, somebody whose family comes from, who's a descendant of slaves. So that part did come in of, people would talk about it, well, he sounds like he's crying when he sings, so, you know, but he's white. So that was, I would say, kind of the main thing that jumps to mind about voice. But thank you for the push there, and yeah, that'd be an interesting thread to take up as well.
Something seems to be buried there that
Yeah.
strikes me as being potentially kind of quite interesting. Anyway, I'll pass the baton on to others.
Thanks, Martin.
Nice to see you.
Thank you, Martin. Vanessa, I think you had a question you'd like to ask.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tamara. That was great. And just on, my question is about something else, but this thing that you just said about he doesn't have the voice because he didn't suffer. I think there's something about ancestry and the lineage of actually being able to voice out the baraka through. So, I mean, I'm just like, I'm loving that. But my question is actually about gender, because it seems like it's all boy bands. And it's all these young men that are, you know, positioning themselves in front of each other, and the women are completely absent. So I think that I only saw one on the cover of that CD or LP towards the end, and the one that you had put at the very beginning, but I didn't see any women performers. You did mention that they had coerced you into performing with them, and so that's my question: is what is happening with the women? Where are their voices? Where's their performativity? Are they not allowed ritually? Are they ritually supposed to enact other pieces of the ritual that are not perceived to be musical, so they don't end up going on stage, but that in the ritual they might actually have a more fundamental role? I'm just curious to know what's happening with the women, because they're always there and important, but when we don't see them, then that means that we need to know.
Right. Thanks for your question. Oh, it's a big question. There's so much I could say. I'll try to keep it brief. In the ritual context, women tend to be more in charge of certain ways that the ritual functions, preparation of food and the people and the spaces, and the rituals are gender separated, and that is intended to be primarily for protection, because going into trance is a very vulnerable state, and women want to be with other women when they pass out and have to be carried over to the side of the ritual, and they're being picked up under their arms. And so for those reasons, at least they're separating them in terms of gender. In my field work, I didn't tend to film women because of modesty codes and women not wanting to be filmed. Women are not Diwan musicians. There's one exception of Hasna Basharia, but she wasn't ritually trained. She plays more in stage and festival settings. But yeah, the women are not musicians in this particular case of Algerian. Other Algerian musics are different, but in this one, it's primarily the men. So the women tend to be more knowledgeable in terms of trance and the bodily worlds of trance and feeling and what's really happening there. The same goes for in Algiers with these boy bands. Yeah, don't really see the women getting involved so much. So it's, yeah. My own role was a bit unique because, I mean, in hindsight, I think the reason the leader asked me to be involved in that is that I think he realized if he had an American woman on stage performing with him, he was more likely to win the prize, which is actually what happened. So it was mutually beneficial in terms of actually put me on Algerian television, and suddenly everybody knew about my research, which wasn't always good, but at least it made some interviews easier. But that was what happened there. And then I had instant friends. But yes, yeah, so they are missing in terms of the musical side, and it was tricky for me as a woman and a musician to navigate those spaces, definitely. But it went all right, yeah. Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Vanessa. Matthew, I think you had a question.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Perfect. Thanks ever so much, Tamara, for a wonderful talk. Really, really rich addition to the series, so thank you. I actually had a question around gender as well, so I won't do that one. So,
okay.
I've got another question. I'm particularly interested in the sort of background here of festivalization, heritageization of the Diwan in particular. And I wondered if you might expand a bit on the circumstances around in the Bashar festival, I think you said, where one of the end goals was to try to have Diwan identified or recognized as intangible cultural heritage. Of course, Gnawa was recently recognized as intangible cultural heritage. So I wondered if you might sort of expand a bit on the circumstances around that in the context of the Bashar Festival and Diwan. Where is the kind of impetus coming from? Is this a grassroots kind of pressure to have Diwan recognized as intangible cultural heritage? Is it coming from certain institutions, governments, so on and so forth? So if you could sort of give a bit more context to that issue, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Matthew. I sort of lost the thread on that a few years back, but from what I understand and what I know, it was not, so that clip that I was going to show you about this festival, this commissaire talking about ICH, was just on the heels of Tuareg music in Algeria being considered intangible cultural heritage. So I understood it as sort of, well, if they can be classified, so can we. And this particular commissaire, who had a personal investment being in charge of the Bashar Festival, also wanting to see this happen for Diwan, and a fan of the music, being a fan of that music. During Khalida Toumi's time as Minister of Culture, which lasted something like 12 years, it was quite long, she was kind of a known fan also of Diwan, and there's many photos of Diwan musicians shaking her hand. So this was part also, there was a kind of momentum at the time, but honestly, I'll have to pick that up and look at that again. I'm not sure whatever became of that. The Bashar festivals very quickly started kind of not disappearing, but there was less and less money. Even when the last time I was there was 2015, they were losing money and sort of the momentum. The festivals used to be weeks long with musicians, and then they were coming now to 3 days. So yeah, but thanks for that question. I'll look back into that.
Yeah, thanks, Tamara. I mean, it might be just an interesting line to follow because, of course, UNESCO and Intangible Cultural Heritage is a massive exercise in developing what is a national repertoire and what sort of musical styles are we going to include and exclude. So it'd be interesting to know where sort of Diwan, and particularly this sort of its pre-Islamic and African roots, fits in the broader kind of spectrum of what is national Algerian music. So yeah, it's just sort of an interesting line to pursue. Yeah,
thanks.
No problem.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for asking my next question as well. So I'll have to think of another one now. We have a question in the text chat from Philip, who says, "Thank you for a very interesting paper, Tamara. I wonder how the Mugzawa repertoire is transmitted, taught in the context of Zawaya."
Yeah. Thanks, Philip. Well, I wouldn't say it's really taught, but most people are just learning by observation and doing. So as I had mentioned at the beginning, so this repertoire comes quite late in the ritual in most places in Algeria. So 3-4 in the morning, when most people have gone home. So to the point that a lot of songs are skipped, that they might just play 30 seconds of each tune. So in some towns I classified 38 Mugzawa songs. In other towns in Algeria, I classified 12. So it depends, but this could be quite a long night if they played everything. So generally, actually, if they're going to skip anything in the ritual, they skip Mugzawa. Also because there's not really people who know how to trance to it anymore. I mentioned that it's so different from the rest of the ritual. The sound of the melodies, the timbres, they're really, really different from everything else. And I sort of see the front part of the Diwan ritual as the greatest hits, and you get lots of people on the space trancing, everyone's happy and excited, and as the night goes on, it dwindles and dwindles. And then you get to Mugzawa and people are tired and they want to go home. And if they play any of them at all, they'll just play maybe 3 to 5 for 30 seconds, and then they all pack up. So this is one of the problems with Mugzawa. it is decreasing, it's not very well known. And on the flip side, then it's seen as more and more exotic, as special knowledge. And so then you have these different groups sort of vying for, well, it's our heritage, no, it's our heritage, no, my father brought it. So then the fact that it's seen as the most voodoo of the repertoire of having these pre-animist practices. So for example, they'll take off, they won't burn incense during these times, or they'll burn a different kind of incense. There's all kinds of things that change here. This creates a lot of anxiety around even singing the songs. So I have quite a few interviews of musicians saying, I don't think we should be singing these at all because they're not in Arabic, they're in this language Kuriya, which we're probably calling the jinn. We don't know what's happening anymore because none of us remember this. So transmission is a huge problem already in Diwan, but especially with Migzawa. So really you have to be an insider and be pretty good at picking these things up. I think Saida, this drumming video I showed you near the beginning with outside drumming, this is kind of the most alive training, if you could say that is at a zawiya, but these guys they grow up with it. So yeah, that's the most I can say about learning. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Thanks, Philip. We've got another question here, which I'm not going to read in full, from Kilkub Taufik, asking about Zar practices in Egypt and linguistics, and how sort of linguistic dynamics play out amongst the Diwan musicians.
Yeah, I was skimming this too. Thanks for the question. Yeah, interesting. They also in Zar that there are linguistic elements that also are understood. Yeah, so it sounds like it's quite similar. So this language Kuriya, I actually started working with linguists on this recently for an article, really trying. So I sent these lyrics from Migzawa songs to native Hausa speakers, 3 different ones, to get their kind of guesses, like, do you understand any of this? And it was quite fascinating what came back. One really exceptional result was from a native Hausa speaker in Ghana who speaks 20 different languages and could point out, he's also a ritual singer, a Hausa ritual singer. So he was able to point out certain things that I would have never caught, and did say it. So basically the phonetics had really changed, the morphology had changed, but he could make some educated guesses about what was being said. And interestingly, some of these were these sort of joking songs between different ethno-linguistic groups, between, for example, Songhai and Hausa. So this was an interesting project. I mean, in the end, the conclusion was still, well, these musicians don't know what they're singing. I mean, there are phrases in Hausa that are still intact that do make sense. For example, there's one about a Fulani man selling his milk, and it was explained to me in Arabic as a man selling his milk, and then in Hausa it's about a man selling milk. So there's some that still have carried on, but largely it's sort of like that old telephone game of people just repeating what they've heard. And this is what Diwan musicians say, and this is how they sang it before, this is how I learned it, but we have no idea what we're singing. So that is mostly happening in these Hausa and Magzawa repertoires.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Great, thank you for the question. We've probably got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. I think I will ask one, and then if anybody else has a sort of final question, either, as I say, type it into the chat or let me know if you'd like to ask it over the microphone. At the start of the talk, Tamara, you sort of set up this sort of oppositional binary between emic and etic. There's these 2 kind of categories, and I wondered what the emic side of things thought of these festivals, what sort of feedback you were getting. Were they very sort of condemnatory of it? Was there a part of sort of celebrating the fact that it was at least bringing Diwan into the sort of public consciousness? Yeah, what were the sort of responses you were seeing there?
Somewhat predictable, a little bit like the sort of old story about, oh, kids these days, and everything's faster, and there's quite a lot of that. But there have been ritual musicians who have come very close to winning, as far as I know. Well, no, that's Mascara in 2016 won the first prize, and they are sort of dyed-in-the-wool of ritual musicians. But it had up until that point often been these young guys who had maybe we're 20, 25. So this caused a lot of controversy during the festival. And this is, this is kind of how I became heard about these controversies. In the daytime, there would be these sort of colloquia that they would hold between musicians and journalists and anybody else, scholars who wanted to come. And they would erupt often into these really hot debates about what is protection. And on the one hand, you had people like the commissaire saying, well, we need to just create a Diwan dictionary. And so we preserve this. And then of course they can't agree on what one word means. So how do you set up a dictionary? So there would be all kinds of debates on, so how do we actually move forward with this? But by and large, the ritual musicians were quite adverse to playing on stage, which, as I briefly mentioned, would involve standing with a gimbri attached to amplifiers and having to do choreography, because you can't just sit there and play the gimbri on stage sitting for 20 minutes as you would in ritual. So these kinds of adaptations were really distasteful to ritual musicians, but they wanted to be a part of that. It was there, as they felt, they'd been doing it their whole life. So they wanted to be part of that conversation and part of this project. So all kinds of discussions came out of that, of maybe we should just have a giant Diwan where everybody's invited. So it was quite fascinating. I went to about 4 of these rituals, and these hours and hours of these debates would be all day long and then music all night. So it was quite, then people would talk for years about the Bashar Festival between the two, between the years that they would happen. So quite a lot there in itself. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you, Tamara. I think we've come to the end of the questions. We've got one final question from Salvatore asking about decolonization. How do you challenge discrimination and reconfigure sedimented knowledge power hierarchies in this context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, hopefully I'll have a chance to go back and speak with people some more. There's definitely still some research to be done about, especially with sort of the quote that you saw from Amazi Kateb around the gimbri and the way it's been taken up as an homage to the Black man. I think, in speaking with a friend of mine, Rashida Lamri, we talked a bit about this on the phone, about has Black Lives Matter and sort of these global movements, has that affected what's happening in Algeria? And in her opinion, it's not. But there's a very particular history in Algeria that has to be addressed. And definitely there's some research coming out now. I don't know if you all have noticed this, but I've certainly been noticing, at least in my Facebook feed, more and more research on racism in the Middle East, Black-white racism in the Middle East. And Ted Swedenborg was just part of a discussion on that. It seems that there is some new research coming out on that, of trying to take these issues and really address them in specific contexts. An article or several articles that are dealing with sort of how do we navigate between Orientalism and reinforcing these sort of stereotypes about Arabs are racist versus apologetics. So it's an exciting time, I think, to be revisiting these questions. And yeah, I'm personally still deciding and moving and navigating how I want to deal with this. This hasn't been the focus of my research up until then, but has always been in the background, of course, especially my own position in the field, which is something that comes into it, obviously. So yeah, thanks for the question. I don't have a well-packaged response for you at this point, but I would, if any of you have thoughts later, and I'm also will add, I'm happy to send some of these links or the videos that we didn't have time for today as well. But yeah, but thank you for the question.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tamara. I think we're going to wrap up now. But thank you, everybody, for being here. And a huge thank you to Tamara for a wonderful talk. I'm sure we're all applauding from behind our video screens, behind our computer screens today. Thank you. Just to say about, as I said at the start, this is a series of events. We've got 2 more events this term before Christmas. The next talk will be on the 3rd of December, Thursday the 3rd of December, which is from Liz Matsushita. Talking about encounters at Africa's border. And then on Monday the 14th of December we have Ala Zuiten talking about my transcultural Oud stories. So if you would like to come to either or both of those events, please have a look at our website. I've just put a link in the chat there, and you can sign up for those talks. Please do look at the website. It's got details of all the events that we're running, and the research outputs we've got coming out of the project. And links to our social media profiles. So please follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, etc., etc. Okay, so thank you again, Tamara. Really, really appreciate it. And thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Stephen, Matthew. Thanks for everybody for coming. Bye.
Tamara.